When I arrived at the old neighborhood, I was devastated to learn that my father had passed away. High blood pressure, they said. Judith had moved out shortly after his death. I wept for the man who had been too weak to stand up to her. I wept for the love he'd lost and the life he'd endured. Judith had destroyed my father, and I wouldn't let her escape her sins. I tracked her down to a small house on the outskirts of town. She was living alone. I began my campaign of terror. The first package I sent contained a dead rat, its body wrapped in newspaper. The second was a box of cockroaches. Each day, I found new ways to torment her. Rotten eggs splattered on her windows, anonymous letters threatening her safety, strange noises outside her house at night. I hired people to show up at her doorstep and scream obscenities, their faces masked to keep her guessing. Some days her window will be shattered at night. She was replacing broken windows every other week. As weeks turned into months, her mental state deteriorated. She started seeing shadows where there were none, jumping at the slightest noise. People in the neighborhood began to whisper, calling her a witch and claiming her house was cursed. I was 12 when my father remarried, 5 years after my mother passed away. I remember how hopeful he looked, how desperately he wanted this woman to bring happiness back into our lives. Her name was Judith, and she was nothing like my mother. Where my mom had been kind and gentle, Judith was harsh, loud, and overbearing. I didn't know then how much pain she would bring into my life. Judith hated me from the moment she laid eyes on me. I didn't understand it at first. How could someone hate a child they barely knew? But as time went on, I realized it wasn't about me. It was about my mother. Judith despised her, even though they had never met. She hated how much I resembled her, from my dark hair to my sharp facial features. Her hatred was subtle at first, hidden behind tight smiles and forced politeness. But as the weeks turned into months, her mask slipped and her true nature emerged. It started with small things. She'd accidentally throw out the clothes I cherished because they had belonged to my mom. She removed all my mother's pictures around the house and burned them. If I left a book on the table, it would mysteriously disappear. She'd criticize me for every little thing, like how I chewed my food, how I walked, even how I breathed. Then the punishments began. The first time she hit me, I was 13. I had accidentally spilled a glass of water on the kitchen floor.
Are you trying to ruin my house? Do you think you can make me trip and die? Is that your plan?
She grabbed a wooden spoon and struck my hands repeatedly until they were red and swollen. My father stood in the doorway, watching helplessly. "Judith, please. He's just a child. Children make mistakes."
Don't you dare tell me how to discipline this brat. If you don't shut up now, I'm going to deal with you in a way that you wouldn't like.
From that moment, I knew my father wouldn't protect me. Judith ruled over him like a tyrant. It didn't help that she was very fat and tall, while my dad was slim and short. A month into their marriage, she took complete control of the household. My father stopped making decisions, stopped speaking up. He was too scared, and I was left alone to face her wrath. By the time I turned 14, Judith's cruelty had escalated. She made me do all the chores like cleaning, cooking, laundry, while she sat on the couch barking orders. If I didn't finish quickly enough, she'd throw whatever was closest at me.
Are you stupid or just lazy?
Her favorite punishment was withholding food. If I made a mistake, she wouldn't let me eat dinner. Some nights, I'd go to bed with my stomach growling, praying for the strength to endure. The worst part was how she humiliated me. She made me scrub the floors on my hands and knees while she invited her friends over to watch.
See how pathetic he is, just like his mother.
They'd laugh while I bit back tears, my knees aching on the hard tiles. I hated how she always brought my late mom up. It felt so disrespectful, but I couldn't say anything about it. At school, I pretended everything was fine. I didn't want anyone to know how bad it was at home. But the truth was written all over me. The bruises on my arms, the exhaustion in my eyes. My teachers would ask if I was okay, and I'd nod, forcing a smile. I knew they were all aware that something was wrong. They called my dad to a meeting once to ask if everything was fine at home. Judith had accompanied my dad. "Everything is fine. It's just that he and his stepmom don't get along. I think it's bothering him." That was all he said. But those words made Judith starve us for a whole week. I knew he couldn't tell them exactly what was happening because he was scared of getting punished by Judith. Yes, she used to beat him up too. One night after she flogged me, I heard her speaking with my dad in their room. He was trying to tell her to go easy on me. However, Judith slapped him. Not only that, she pulled his hair so much that a few strands pulled out, then she forced them into his mouth. From then, I knew she was abusing my dad too. When I was 16, Judith's hatred reached a boiling point. One night, I accidentally dropped a plate while washing dishes. It shattered on the floor, and I froze, knowing what was coming.
You useless little bastard!
She grabbed me by the collar and dragged me into the living room. My father was sitting on the couch, staring at the TV as if he couldn't hear her screaming.
Look at what your son did. Do something and stop sitting there like you're dead.
My father opened his mouth, but no words came out. The annoyance led to me getting punched by Judith. She punched me so badly until I could barely walk. I cried for my dad to help, but he didn't move. He looked at me with tears and an apology in his eyes. I couldn't blame him. Of course, he wouldn't be able to do anything to avoid getting punished too. When I turned 17, I started dreaming of escape. I didn't know where I'd go, but anywhere was better than here. I began saving every bit of money I could find, hiding it in an old shoebox under my bed. But Judith found it.
What's this? Wow. Are you stealing from me now? Are you trying to escape with my money? I can't believe this, child. You think you can just leave after everything we've done for you? I'll teach you a lesson.
I thought she would flog me, but no. She took every last dollar and spent it on herself. She went for shopping and bought so many things until she had to hire another taxi to follow her home. A week later, the final blow came. I had just finished cleaning the bathroom when she called me downstairs.
Pack your things. You're leaving.
I stared at her, not understanding.
You think I'm going to keep feeding and housing you at 17? Get out.
I turned to my father, my heart pounding. Judith, please, he's my only child. Don't do this, please. She slapped him across the face, silencing him.
Don't you dare defend him. He's like this because you and that foolish dead wife of yours never disciplined him.
I packed my bag in a daze, my hands shaking. As I stepped out the door, she stood in the doorway, her arms crossed.
Good riddance.
Life on the streets was brutal. The nights were freezing, and the days were filled with hunger. I scavenged for food in trash bins and slept wherever I could find shelter, like a bench in the park, an abandoned doorway, or under a bridge. But I refused to give up. I couldn't let Judith win. After a week of aimless wandering, I stumbled upon a restaurant with a help wanted sign in the window. I walked in, desperate and hopeful. Can you wash dishes? I nodded vigorously. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. I spent my nights scrubbing pots and pans until my hands were raw. During the day, I searched for a second job. 3 weeks later, I found one at a hotel, cleaning rooms and mopping floors. Sleeping on the streets while working 2 jobs was exhausting, but I held on to the hope of a better future. After 3 months of saving every penny I could, I finally managed to rent a tiny apartment. It wasn't much, just a single room with peeling paint and a leaky faucet, but it was mine. One evening, while cleaning the lobby at the hotel, a guest struck up a conversation with me. He was a businessman, and he talked about cryptocurrency like it was the future. Take a risk. It might change your life. I didn't have much to invest, but I scraped together what I could and bought a coin he recommended. At first, I thought I'd made a mistake. The market fluctuated, and I watched my small investment rise and fall. But then, everything changed. The coin skyrocketed. In a matter of months, I had enough money to quit my jobs and start something I'd always dreamed of, which was a restaurant. Opening my first restaurant was daunting. Business was slow at first, and I worried I'd made a mistake. But I believed in my cooking. I poured my heart into every dish and started advertising online. Slowly but surely, customers began to trickle in. Word spread. People loved my food, and my little restaurant became the talk of the town. Within a year, the place was so packed that I had to turn people away. I used my earnings to buy a larger space, and business exploded. Soon, people from neighboring towns begged me to open more branches. I expanded again, and then again. Within a few years, I had restaurants scattered across the state. My name became synonymous with great cooking, and my face was on billboards and magazines. By the time 10 years had passed, I was a multimillionaire and a renowned chef. But despite all my success, a part of me felt incomplete. I couldn't forget my father. I decided it was time to visit him. When I arrived at the old neighborhood, I was devastated to learn that my father had passed away. High blood pressure, they said. Judith had moved out shortly after his death. I wept for the man who had been too weak to stand up to her. I wept for the love he'd lost and the life he'd endured. Judith had destroyed my father, and I wouldn't let her escape her sins. I tracked her down to a small house on the outskirts of town. She was living alone. I began my campaign of terror. The first package I sent contained a dead rat, its body wrapped in newspaper. The second was a box of cockroaches. Each day, I found new ways to torment her. Rotten eggs splattered on her windows, anonymous letters threatening her safety, strange noises outside her house at night. I hired people to show up at her doorstep and scream obscenities, their faces masked to keep her guessing. Some days her window will be shattered at night. She was replacing broken windows every other week. As weeks turned into months, her mental state deteriorated. She started seeing shadows where there were none, jumping at the slightest noise. People in the neighborhood began to whisper, calling her a witch and claiming her house was cursed. One day, I decided to confront her. I knocked on her door, and when she opened it, she recoiled at the sight of me.
You evil bastard. I know you're the one behind this. Stop it, will you?
Stop? After everything you did to me? To my father? I know he died because of you. She looked like she didn't care. She tried apologizing, but I knew she was only doing that to stop me from tormenting her more. She wasn't sorry for what she did to my father and I. You'll pay for the rest of your miserable life. One night, one guy I paid wrote something frightful on her window, with blood saying, "We coming for you this night." In her desperation to escape the torment, she tried to run. She tripped on the front steps and fell hard, breaking her spine. The hospital discharged her with the grim news. She would never walk again. Judith hired a caregiver, but my torment didn't stop. The caregivers were too frightened to stay due to the sounds I paid people to make outside the house at night, and caregivers seeing death animals every day in front of the house, they all decided to run, leaving her alone and helpless. She hired 2 more, but the result was the same. Eventually, no one would come near her. Her neighbors avoided her house, convinced it was haunted. Alone and paralyzed, Judith was trapped in a living nightmare. A month later, her heart gave out. The official cause of death was a heart attack, but I knew better. Judith had died of fear and guilt. No one mourned her. No one spoke kindly of her. Her family members couldn't be found. She was buried at a shitty cemetery. She left the world hated and alone. I tracked down where she was buried and paid people to destroy her grave at night so no one would ever know she existed. Thanks for watching.